Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Husak. I'll be moderating this panel we have for you today. A little bit about myself. I'm a researcher at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm closely involved with the Harvest program as well as the Family Early Warning Systems Network. I think we have a really exciting set of presenters today for you, covering a variety of different aspects of food production and food production monitoring from satellite and Earth observations. And so I think we have a pretty dense program, so we'll get right into it. I do want to say just before we get started that today's presentation will be recorded, so you'll be able to rewatch later or share interesting things with your colleagues. And also that means, yeah, this will be preserved. So with that, I'm going to introduce Alyssa Whitcraft, who is from the Harvest program. I'm going to put her slides up, and she's going to walk us through a quick introduction to the slides that, or the presentations that we'll see later. So one moment, please.
Great, thank you, Greg. While you transition that, I just want to test, is my audio working?
Yes, we hear you quite well.
Perfect. I'll introduce myself quickly then. Greg mentioned, I'm Alyssa Whitcraft. I am from the University of Maryland, where I'm an associate research professor, but I'm also in the context of the Harvest Consortium, both the associate director and the program manager. Harvest is a NASA program, a relatively new NASA program we just started 2 years ago. That's really about, it's a part of the Applied Sciences program, and it's really about enhancing, improving the awareness and use of Earth observations for informed agricultural decisions. So not just NASA observations and not just NASA-based methodologies and everything, but really just pulling together all of the satellite-based Earth observations and the ground components that contribute to that toward making meaningful decisions, both in the food security as well as the agricultural market context as well. We have a big focus on application-ready research methods, and you'll see some of those in the presentations today. And we're also really working on the outreach part. I mentioned awareness specifically because there's a lot of work to be done in connecting our tools and our capabilities to communities that are not linked necessarily into remote sensing. And so kind of reducing that siloing and really strengthening the impact of the work that we're doing to communities who can really use the information. Next slide, please. Hopefully you just click and it goes on. And if not, no worries, I can riff. We are a consortium of over 40 partners at this point. We've got both people who are kind of remote sensing experts, or people who are experts in ground data collection, or anything kind of along that sort of data to decision cycle related to Earth observations in order to make these informed decisions. But we also have the end users. So we work directly with the people who need to use the information to whether it's a decision about mobilizing food aid, or it's a decision about how to assess whether a crop has failed and whether an insurance payment needs to take place, or we're helping supply chain companies verify whether the places from which they're acquiring goods are sustainable and using conservation agriculture practices. We have all kinds of different kind of activities within our portfolio, and along kind of this big agricultural picture and the food systems that we're trying to support. Next slide, please. And so we have a lot of different activities that we're doing, and one of our core kind of areas of research, and again, the research is geared toward eventual applications, is in the sort of food security and early warning space, but also within the crop yield and condition space. And so Summer, our partner at IFPRI, has taken a great initiative of pulling together this webinar, and Greg, who's another partner and the co-lead of the food security and early warning activity, has also stepped up, and Gary's going to be one of the panelists today as well. They're the co-leads of the food security and early warning activity within Harvest. And we have a variety of other activities and sort of different regions and scales of application, and different underpinning activities like education, tech transfer, developing data portals and data distribution modalities, and all these sort of facilitating functions that can help the research really reach a variety of users and help them kind of empower the decisions that they need to make. But today we'll really be focusing on the crop yield and condition and food security and early warning activities of Harvest within the context of broader community activities that Summer's brought together in this webinar as well. So I don't want to delay the webinar too much. We have a website, it's nasaharvest.org. We also have a really active Twitter account. And so I encourage you to go there and find out more. And if needed, please contact me with any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alyssa. That's a good context. With that, I'm going to pass the controls over to Belén Franch. Belén is a distinguished researcher at the University of Valencia and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Maryland. She previously was an associate researcher at NASA, and her main research is focused on the use of remote sensing satellite images to analyze Earth's surface. And with that, please take it away, Belén.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little about our research on yield estimation and forecast. Our focus is mainly using coarse spatial resolution data. Our main goal is more working at global scale to inform markets and association or agencies like AMIS. About the crop yield, condition, and forecast. So coarse spatial resolution looks like the most convenient source of data. Why? Because it ranges up to the 80s back with AVHRR. It continues with MODIS data and will continue with BIRS, and it might work together with Sentinel-3, the European satellite. Okay, so the idea is that we have a lot of years to train models, empirical models. That's our basic model. It's based on empirical relationship between biophysical parameters and the final yield. So coarse spatial resolution has lots of can you hear me well? Because I got a message from the webinar panel. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you well, Alyssa. This
okay,
is Alyssa.
perfect.
I hope it's the same for other people.
Okay,
yeah,
okay, great. I just got a message in my webinar. I just want to make sure. Okay, so going back to the presentation, so basically the main problem about coarse spatial resolution is that we cannot search well the fields. So we have an example of a MODIS image of the same region, and then the same observation for Landsat and Rapid Eye with higher spatial resolution. With MODIS, the problem is that we don't see well the definition of the fields, so all the signal is mixed. We don't observe just the targeted field, but we have a mixture of different crops or surfaces. So aside from having like lots of information from historical data, we have to deal with this problem. So the way of like solving it or taking care of this, it's using like or analyzing how much purity, how much percentage of crop we have within each pixel, and then try to isolate that crop that we want to study. So for that, there's been different approaches. I'm gonna focus on the model that Inbal Becker-Reshef developed in 2010, which was applied at the subnational level, in the case, for instance, in the US at county level. So at county level, she was like focusing on the purest pixels. That means that the areas with the higher percentage of the crop that the model was targeting, and just focusing on those pixels, trying to relate it with the NDVI peak. So analyzing the time series of the NDVI for that crop and focusing on the peak and relate it empirically with the yield values. This model was trained in Kansas, where we have like good statistics, and was applied successfully to the US. Here we have an example of the result. It's an error at national level around 10%, and also over the US for the historical data using AVHRR with errors around 8% back in the 80s, and more or less a good response like over the time series. It was also applied to Ukraine and China, but the main problem of the model was that we had to wait until the peak in fact happens in order to be applied. So we have to wait until all the different administrative units reaches that peak in order to provide a yield estimation at national level. So in order to solve this, in 2015 we presented an improvement based on the inclusion of the thermal data. So we know that the plant requires a number of accumulated temperature in order to move to the following phenological state, to advance its life. So relating how advanced or how much temperature the plant has accumulated with the status or the evolution of the NDVI can help us to forecast which is going to be the peak before it in fact happens. Okay, so this basically like the main idea of this model. You can have more information in the link I added on there. And here we can see the error evolution of this model depending on how far we are from the peak, okay, at national level. So with this model, we could forecast which is going to be the peak with an error between 10–15%, up to 2.5 months before the harvest. So that's a good advantage. Okay. So the next improvement was to look for a better estimation of the yield itself. So recently we developed this method. It's called ARIA. Like I'm pretty fan of Game of Thrones, so I thought it was a good idea to name it like that, taking advantage of the Y for yield. So. And it is based on the DVI, not the NDVI evolution. So DVI is just the difference between near infrared and red. And basically what the main difference with the original model is that we don't focus just on the purest pixels on the county or the subnational level. We use the information over the whole county. Here we have an example of a county in Kansas, and we represent which is the DVI versus the purity or the percentage of the crop, in this case wheat, for the whole county. And we extrapolate, we unmix, which is the signal that is coming just from wheat, taking advantage of the information of the whole county. So in that case, it's less biased, or it's minimized the error. Okay, and also the model is not just focused on the seasonal peak of this DVI or of this index, vegetation index. We also look at the length of the peak, how long the peak remains. We notice that some years the peak it's wider than others, and it is positively correlated with the yield. Okay, so we included also that information. And finally, the evaporative fraction. It's linked to the water availability, and it's for accounting for any stress condition after the peak happens. It's just a linear model that it's calibrated for its county or its subnational level. Here I'm talking about counties because most of the examples are in the US, but it has been applied to other countries, as I will show later. So every subnational administration or administrative level, it's trained individually and it's calibrated individually based on these three regressors. And so this is just the main scheme. I'm not gonna go into detail about it, of how we apply it, but we take into account like different MODIS products. And at the end, I just wanted to show the validation of the model at subnational level, at county level in the US, with errors around 15–17%. And at national level, it's really good. It's an error around 4% with really high correlation. That means that it works well for maximum and minimum yields. Okay. And this is just the validation over different countries. I put everything together. It's true that Germany and France, they have much larger yields, but I can assure that individually, more or less, every country shows similar statistics with errors around 15% at subnational level and 7% at national level. So I have to say that right now we have covered 60% of global wheat exports. So that's pretty good. Right now we are running in Australia and Canada. So we hope we can reach 80 to 90% global exports. We have also adapted the yield forecasting model to the new improved model, and this is just a preliminary result and showing that we can now also forecast the subnational level estimations of yield, and the errors remain more or less constant throughout the season. It's true that we still have to work a little on the model, but preliminary results are really promising. Finally, we are also applying the model to other crops like corn. Again, this is preliminary results. Maybe one of the regressors is not so important in corn, or we can look for others, but by now it looks really similar results to wheat. It's around 9% error at subnational level, 4% error at national, and also good correlation, which means that it works well for extreme years, and also soybean with very similar errors than corn and wheat. So basically, just the main ideas about this model. It's a model based on coarse spatial resolution data. Still, coarse resolution has lots of things to provide, especially for empirical models that we need historical information to train those models. And if we don't include like years with like extreme events, maybe this model is not going to work well if that extreme event happens in the future. It is based on the peak of the DVI, or the vegetation index, also the length of the peak, and also the evaporative fraction information. And the errors are pretty good, 7% national level, 15% subnational. It works well with extreme yield conditions, but we still have issues regarding flooding. And this is the case of France in 2016, when an unexpected late flooding damaged the crop yield, and we still have to work on it because it's really unique. So that's what I was saying. It's like, especially when we include more years in the analysis, it helps us like understanding better how the crop reacts and looking for any variable that can improve our training. And the first results on forecasting show really promising results, and also on other cereals like corn and soybean. Basically, that was it on my side.
So next we're going to move to Jake Campolo. He is a PhD student at Stanford. He's doing research with David Lebel on high-resolution satellite yield mapping and how it can be used to inform farm-level crop and soil management. Today he's got a presentation looking at 2 countries, and also I think presenting some of their general methodologies.
Thanks, Greg. So I'll be presenting about satellite yield mapping, work that we've done in Kenya and Nepal at high resolution in order to understand variability and inform crop management for smallholder farmers. So this figure on the right here is from a paper previously published by the lab, and this is an example of a yield map at 10-meter resolution for Kenya and Tanzania. So these yield maps let us measure or estimate yields for individual farms across the country. And this is really important for several reasons. So these smallholder farms, which are defined as farms less than 5 hectares in area, produce more than 50% of food calories for many countries, sometimes up to 90%. So it's really important that we understand how they're performing in terms of yield. However, measuring every individual farm through traditional survey-based methods is really unfeasible and cost-intensive. So these satellite methods provide an alternative where we can estimate yields across the whole country at a scale fine enough to look at individual farms and assess why they're performing better or worse than farms in the nearby vicinity. So I'm just going to talk about how we get to these yield maps. To start, we first need to know where the crop of interest is going. So here's an example from my work in Nepal, mapping wheat. And this is a time series of wheat for the fields that we surveyed during a field visit earlier in March and April. And this is a time series of NBR, which is a vegetation index comparing near infrared to shortwave infrared. So if you see in these curves, the average NBR for wheat is much higher during the wheat growing season from January to May than as is for other crops. So we can use these differences in curves between various vegetation indices and also raw bands from these satellite sensors. We're using Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 currently. We can use these differences to entrain machine learning models such as random forests to learn to distinguish wheat pixels from non-wheat pixels. And what that looks like on the ground is we go from just a raw image to a map of where there is and where there is not wheat growing. And then from there, we can quantify how much wheat is being produced based on the yields we estimate for those specific areas. So one of the main challenges we face when trying to do this high resolution yield mapping is imagery contamination. Here's an example of cloudy images. So if we're trying to sense the ground and clouds are in the way, obviously that's a problem because we're not actually sensing the field. So we developed a method to overcome that through recursive harmonic fitting. And what this means is essentially, so these are a time series of a different vegetation index, red edge chlorophyll index, for a selection of wheat fields also in Nepal. You can see in dark red, that's the raw value of the vegetation index over time. And so, for example, in the lower left panel, that very low point in February is a cloudy image. So the vegetation index is contaminated. That's not really an accurate reading of the field. So in order to overcome this, so we can actually have a time series to work with, we fit a series of harmonic fits, which are modeled as y as a function of a sum of cosine and sine terms. And we do this multiple times, each time dropping out the minimum between the fit and the previous fit or the raw. So what this does is iteratively we're working closer and closer to getting a more accurate representation of what the growing season peak looks like. So you can see for the red of fit 5 that the peak reaches the actual peak, but other values in between are higher than normal. So they're accounting for that, or sorry, they're compensating for that cloudiness by being predicted as higher than the raw data actually is showing. So the importance of this is that once we have these uncontaminated synthetic time series, we can derive important metrics from these growing season curves in order to predict yield. So on the right is an example of this red edge chlorophyll index, the seasonal maximum mapped out over an area of Nepal. And so this image is uncontaminated by clouds, and we can use this in our yield estimations. So we do yield estimation in several ways. Primarily, it's a linear function of vegetation and weather. So we use the vegetation index, in this case, the maximum that I showed before, and also a selection of weather covariates that are important to yield. So temperature, especially in sensitive growing periods, has a very strong impact on yields. Also, precipitation and radiation can affect how much yield is produced at the end of the season. So we want to include all that in the model. And we train this model in two different ways. There's a calibrated approach in which we use yield data that was collected on the ground and combined with satellite data of our vegetation index and weather. So for example, using MODIS temperature and CHIRPS precipitation. And so we use these data to calibrate our yield model. There's also an uncalibrated approach where we use crop simulations to generate a growing season and use that as a basis for our estimation. So we use the AppSim simulator, which, given a set of management scenarios and daily weather, can output the predicted daily biomass for the crop and end of season yield. So training our model off of this simulation output doesn't require ground data. But as you can see, because of that, it's prone to bias. So on the left here is our crop cut calibrated yield, which was developed based off ground data collected in Nepal in 2016. And on the right is what is skim yield. Scalable crop yield mapper is the technique that is the uncalibrated approach is called. So while still it is able to explain up to 25% of the variance in our validation data, it's still biased lower than actual. So having ground data is helpful, but without it, it's still able to make approximation estimates of yield. So finally, once we've predicted yield, we want to answer questions about heterogeneity or variation within an area. So here's another figure from the Kenya and Tanzania paper where gridded soil nutrient maps produced for the region at 250 meters were used in combination with the yield maps produced by our lab. And soil nutrients were able to explain up to 70% of the variation in yields. And using, again, random forests, we were able to look at the relative importance of each of these soil nutrients in determining yields. So this is a helpful way to understand why some farms might be yielding more or less than others in a given area. So this is a way to identify problems. And then I'm taking that a step further with my work in Nepal, investigating this soil question further, looking at nonlinear effects of soil on yields, and also how fertilizer effectiveness depends on soil quality. The reason for this being, if we can map yields effectively and we have good soil data for the area, we understand the relationship between soil, fertilizer, and yield, we can make these precision management recommendations based on a farm's soil. So for instance, if you're in an organic matter deficient soil, certain fertilizers might perform better or worse, and certain amendments might be better or worse. So we want to be able to know which input will perform best for the farmer. so that they can maximize their production, maximize their profit. And so that's where this work is heading. And yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jake. I think that was a great presentation and a nice contrast to maybe some of the methods that were shown in the first talk. With that, we're going to move to our next presenter. Summer Allen is a senior research coordinator at IFPRI, but based up in the Bay, so maybe a neighbor of Jake there at Stanford University, and focused on food security and nutrition. For the research she's presenting today, she's working with Sunho Kim, a senior data manager at IFPRI, to understand the implications for food security through satellite data.
This work is a joint work with IFPRI, University of Maryland, and We Robotics. And Greg already introduced me, but I work as a senior research coordinator at IFPRI, and I'm a visiting scholar at Stanford. So yes, Jake and I are neighbors. I'm working on this with Sunho Kim and Ritvik Sahapal, and he is at University of Maryland, and we have a number of other people that we're working with at We Robotics and Agri-Info in Tanzania. This is work that was funded in part by NASA Harvest and also the Food Security Portal, which is funded by the European Commission. So one of the reasons we wanted to look at this type of work is because, as Jake already mentioned, IFPRI does a lot of field surveys, and they're very expensive to go and ask farmers what their yields are. It's very time inefficient. We get that information quite late, and the quality of the information that we receive isn't great. So in order to respond to shocks more rapidly, it would be great to be able to use satellite data to understand the constraints for farmers, especially small-scale farmers in places like Africa. So we ended up working in Dodoma. It's a region that has a lot of maize production, and we worked in two different sections of Dodoma. We worked in a section with small-scale farmers that are shown here in yellow, and larger, medium-sized farmers in blue. And this was primarily maize and sunflower growers. We also collected information on cassava and beans, but the amount of cassava and beans that were in monocropping, which I'll explain later, really limited our ability to look at those crops until now. So we used a range of data inputs. I think a lot of us are using planet data. It has a higher spatial resolution, and it's really helpful for delineating our fields. And we also use drones equipped with RGB cameras to better collaborate this type of information that we're getting from the field. So we would be able to create an NDVI map using the drones and match that to what we were seeing with the satellite data. And then we also did farmer surveys on both the production in 2017 and the production in 2018 and how much of their crop that they lost. So as I mentioned, we had a survey of about 300 farmers, and it was a really short survey done on mobile phones to ask how much they were producing, how much they lost. As it's been talked in a lot of literature, this information is sometimes valuable. It is valuable, but it's not always completely accurate. And it depends on the type of questions you're asking, when you're asking the questions, and we'll explain that a little bit later as we see with the data. We also did GPS plot mapping, so we walked the areas of the plots because a lot of times we wanted to be able to match that to what we were seeing with the satellite data and have a really clear picture of the plot. And then we also used the drones to help verify the plot boundaries and to verify the satellite data information. So for the drones, we were working with We Robotics in Tanzania, and we used a fixed wing drone that had a multispectral sensor, and it covered the 4 bands, green, red edge, and near infrared. And this is, like, as I mentioned, we use this to calibrate the satellite data. And you can see here that we have the NDVI that was created by the drone that we could then match to what we were seeing with our satellite data. So our hypothesis, as many doing this work, is that we think that end of season yield forecast is a good proxy for crop conditions. So just before harvest, we would expect that that would be a good proxy for crop conditions. So using that, we looked at what our forecast would be using the GeoSIF model. So the GeoSIF model is used in many different countries and globally. It takes account that each crop has different responses to abiotic factors, so temperature, precipitation, and solar radiation, and that we are looking at the validity of the system by evaluating mid-season yield estimates with the end-of-season yields from the farmers. So GeoSIF is implemented in this way. So this is the steps of implementing GeoSIF, and this is something that Ritvik and our colleagues at the University of Maryland know much more about. But it performs pretty well for globally. And as you can see, if we look at how it performs globally, it has a prediction error of between 3 and 5% for key producing countries, which is pretty good. And the global level, you can see the prediction for maize, soybean, spring wheat, and winter wheat are all quite good. And at a national level, for example, in Ukraine, the winter wheat production using GCVI also can predict quite well the variation between good, poor, and average production, both for different regions of the country. So one of the things that GeoSIF uses in DVI, and one of the things that Ritvik looked into was, could we use GCVI, because there are papers such as Burke and Lobel that are at Stanford that have demonstrated the use of and the value of using GCVI when we have healthy plants that we're trying to measure. When a plant is very healthy, and many of you on the call will know much better this type of information, but it can saturate when the vegetation is healthy. So we tried using GCVI to see if it would perform better than NDVI in our model. So what we did was use the GeoSIF model that has been built and used globally to see, can it work at a really local scale, and can we use it and make it match with data that we're collecting from farmers in Tanzania. We used this production data that we collected in 2017 and 2018. And while we collected information from about 300 farmers, we had about 200 farmers that had plots that were 1.5 hectares or greater. We ended up using these farmers because our results at the moment aren't great for smaller scale farmers, so less than 1.5 hectares, which, as all of you know, is quite a lot of farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's something that we want to keep working on to see how we can make our model fit for smaller scale farmers. But we then used these farmers that were greater than 1.5 hectares to make this reading for the vegetation index that's a little more stable, and then we projected the crop yield for the peak GCVI and NDVI. So we do see there's a meaningful relationship between the satellite database metrics and the observed crop yields, but I will mention here that we have a very small sample that we're working on at the moment, and we hope to be able to use more of the sample that we collected once we get more into the model. So as you can see in these graphs, that GCVI is shown at the top and NDVI at the bottom. So we see that GCVI has been able to distinguish a little bit better between above average and below average when it's compared to NDVI. So this is for sunflower. And even though it's a small sample, it is interesting to see that we do see them tracking. We do see a correlation between the GCVI and the farmer yields. This is for white maize, and we see the same thing. We see that there is some relationship between GCVI and the yields. We see that more with GCVI than we do with NDVI. And this is basically using a linear model because we that fit better. But we do see, if you see in the right part of the slide, it's 2018, and the left part of the slide is 2017. 2017 clearly does not fit as well, and this could likely be due to recall data. We asked in 2018, the beginning of 2018, what their production was in 2017. And then at the end of the harvest in 2018, we asked about their production. So you can imagine there is a 6-month or so lag in They probably remembered better their production from 2018 than 2017. So it could be this is due to recall data. Our findings are that we do see a relationship between GCVI and our yields. And we found, as I mentioned, that linear regression works best. It doesn't at the moment fit very well with intercrop fields, but we keep working on this to evaluate this further to see, if we incorporate some intercropped maize with a lower lying crop, will it make a difference? And we then in next year hope to expand this type of work in Ethiopia. Being able to use the drones, the satellite, and the recall data was really helpful in terms of being able to understand what was going on in the field. So I think it was an interesting trial. And that's all I have.
All right, great, Summer. Thank you very much. I think that was some really cool technology, and yeah, a nice scale, nice presentation. So moving forward now, we're going to look, or we have a presentation from James Warner. He's a research coordinator at IFPRI based in Ethiopia. He's also the office head of IFPRI's Eastern and Southern office, and has worked extensively in Eastern and Southern Africa as both an academic and economic policy consultant.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon. For us, it's evening, and I've got a little a party going on outside. So if that becomes annoying, please let me know. It's it's later in the evening, and there's some kind of cocktail party going on outside my office. Okay, so this project I can see some similarities, and it's good that Summer put this whole project, this whole proposal together, because we see some overlaps with different things. For us, this is a project that we're trying to use existing data, government data, to try to create an early warning system that would be useful and accepted by government policymakers. My background is economics and more of the ground data collection, traditional survey collection. My colleagues at GW are more of the remote sensing, using that kind of information. So we put those together. We call it like data fusion to try to come up with some interesting results. We've had a couple of successes, and this is one that was very inexpensive to do, and we think has some initial promising results. And we've got some things going forward I might mention at the end that we're working on as well. But this is one piece that we're talking about. Okay, so I think that everyone knows, I guess by now, about Tanzania and Nepal and others, that we're, those of us in the developing field, these farmers have small holdings, sort of fragmented holdings, multi-crops. So it's a challenge to sort of get the remote sensing. It's obviously relying on rain-fed systems. And the vulnerability is coming when there's a rain change as well. And obviously agriculture is a major part of Ethiopian the economy. For us, we were kind of inspired by the 2015-16 drought. In Ethiopia, there was a small drought that had large impacts in certain areas of the country, although not in the major crop growing areas. So it was it influenced some areas in the northeastern part of the country, as you can see here, and really in the July month, which is sort of in the middle of the crop growing season. This had a big impact, seemingly from it was regular rains for the rest of the crop season, but then July seemed to be the anomaly, which then set in motion some areas with some higher damages. I put this one in to show that we have these relatively small, so this is a government data set that collects from about 45,000 households a year. It's production-based data. These areas are about 24 square kilometers on average. They interview 20 out of the 200 farmers in that area, and we've sort of aggregated that to sort of influence, what we have. Our basic variable, ground training variable of interest is farmer-reported damage. And that seems to correlate well with NDVI and others, so we feel a little bit comfortable with that. I put this one in just to show you that there is high variability at the local area. These are district level map, these sub-district, well, this is district at the areas. And what's happening here is that there was significant crop loss in this area, but it's high variability. We're getting sort of in the dark, heavy circles are above average, and then the empty, larger circles are below average. And so while the mean is about 46% crop damage in 2015 and 16, you can see that almost none of these observations have that mean. It sort of bifurcates to low damage and high damage and quite spatially heterogeneous. And so this creates a challenge for determining where high damage is occurring and sort of aggregating in different areas. What should we do? This comes from a farmer anecdote who basically told us, hey, we had our crops were wiped out, but the next village over had the best year ever. So this is sort of, sort of picks up on this variability at the local level. So our objective is to use this remote sensing, try to pick up substantial crop losses early in the season, and then we use this data is all this. On the left is the government data. We use 5 cereal crops, which are the predominant cereal crops for the country. And then we have the damage reported, and obviously we can see the 2015 spike in crop damage based on drought. So we use this and try to predict. We train it, and then we try to predict using in the early part of the crop season high damage. We chose a cutoff of 25% as being significant crop damage. We got this from the data from some experts. We have this longitudinal data set where they sampled the same 24 square kilometers for 6 years in a row for these cereal crops, and now we're using the mid-season to use the remote sensing to predict high damage early. Variables, I guess this is basically, we have these 1,750 small areas we call subcavellis, 6 years, so about 10,000 observations. But each subcavelli has 20 farmers, which we've aggregated into a single farmer. We use geographic information and climate information as well in the input data. We use random forests. I think we've talked about that. So that's sort of our training set, and find the variables that we need. Let's see here. So we grid that such that we find the best parameter that optimizes the dependent variable explanations. Here's the model. And so we find that basically the difference of the NDVI maximum point from its previous years, that has a very high explanatory importance in explaining the damage. If that is early or later, then it has a big impact. And then the leading area under the curve of the rainfall leading up to the maximum NDVI is another one. But I want to talk about a couple others: the plant dates, and then one of the others on the max that I want to show you in a minute. So this is sort of the importance of which variables were important for explaining which ones were explaining the high damage. And so these are marginal effects. And so this is sort of and we do like to blend, local knowledge with some of these remote sensing. In this period in 2015, farmers were told extensively through extension services that they should be planting early in the season. That's what the advice was from the extension services, and that appears to be, if you move to the far left, if they planted early, they seem to have suffered some higher damage. And then if you kind of planted during the regular, during the normal periods of damage, where plant date is 0, there seem to be relatively low damage. And then of course later, although the later ones I think would pick up that they had an early season crop failure, then they replanted, and so they don't obviously they have to plant a quick maturing seed that would suggest that they don't have as much output. This one is of just picking up on the NDVI, if the median relative to the median NDVI, if it's obviously to the left, if it's low relative to the average in that area, then of course there'll be higher damage. If it's to the right, then it's less damage. So we separated out the data. 85% we put into the training data, and we separated out 15% into the out of sample. And so this is a relatively rare occurrence that 25% damage is reported. So you can see on the right of of the first table, which is on maize, that we had about 70 out of the 1,300 observations, about 70 reported high damage, and then our recall rate was about 81%. So we got 81% right. And then, of course, we don't really report that with this rare occurrence. You don't. The high accuracy doesn't matter because, of course, that's pretty easy to do. That most report low damage. So that's the 1182. That's not that interesting. The 36, I think, is interesting. That's a false positive, the type 1 error. And I think we could play with that a little bit and maybe raise that to try to reduce the type 2 error, and then we could sort of see if we could get more, because obviously if in an early warning system, if these trigger in these areas, and then the you know, there's some sort of warning system, you can obviously check on those areas and then they can report that there was actually none. So the 36 false positive is, to me, is you know, not as important as the 13 missed in the top. So, but anyway, we got 81% for maize and about 65% for wheat. So finally, just sort of going forward, this is a very coarse data that's you know, existing data. We use MODIS, and we're getting relatively successful tripping of this 25%. We've gone through this and sort of followed through this panel data, and we've seen some persistent high damage neighborhoods, for example, behind rain shadows and some geographic features that might suggest that we could sort of focus the model a little bit and say, in some sort of Bayesian approach, and say, okay, we're getting these perennial high damage areas, then that would be more likely to be the areas with which they would report high damage. There's a lot of variability at the local level of what's reported damage, and so we're getting this sort of non-parametric distributions. The mean is much lower than the median is much lower than the mean, so we have to sort of figure out that. There's been some problems with estimating crop damage forecasts early in the crop season and not accounting for weighting this or something because of the variable of where this is occurring and what's happening. There was an overestimation in 2015-16 by some major researchers that came to the wrong conclusion that there was a serious thing, because basically there was a high damage in in more remote, fragile areas, and so it led to some projections that were incorrect. And finally, I just want to say, from a person that works with policy, we are developing these very sophisticated methods, but we really should think about how to make them accessible to policymakers. And one thing, I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago and just saw that you know, there's still some disaster preparedness early warning systems in Ethiopia where the local officials are sending through the mail early warning system notifications. So we have a long way to go. We have these very sophisticated methods, but we really have to think about how we build trust and how we sort of make these things acceptable and understandable to people, and then give them access to sort of do that. And so we're working on those things as well with dashboards and others, and trying to show relationships between traditional survey data and remote sensing and things that helps sort of policymakers better understand it. A lot of the technical people are certainly much more versed and accept them, but it's more difficult to do the policy people. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot, James. I think really interesting study, and I appreciate those concluding remarks too. I think that was a really nice perspective. So next we're going to move to Dr. Molly Brown. She's the Chief Scientist Officer at 6th Grain, a global provider of agricultural information technologies and remote sensing solutions, and she's affiliated with the University of Maryland and the Harvest program. She is actually in transit and joining us from the airport. I think she may have to board a flight soon, so she may have to condense things a bit, but we'll take as much of Molly as we can get. And yeah, with that, let's learn a little more about 6th Grain.
So I have been working on cropped area mapping in the context of 6th Grain, and we are a private organization, business to business, and we have been creating cropped area maps for decision support for businesses such as Syngenta and BASF and others who want to know how big the maize and wheat market is in Africa. Yes, so our focus here is decision support and providing business quality cropped area mapping. So here is our approach. You'll see that that we have various tools throughout the decision cycle, and the cropped area maps are really for understanding who is growing maize where, and so and be able to provide statistically representative information in countries like in Southern and Eastern Africa that do not have other sources of information. So we have been producing 30-meter maps for annually for maize, wheat, soybean, and sunflower since 2014. And it's representative. So here you can see we have mapped about 25 countries across Africa and the Middle East, including Iran, Iraq, and Egypt, Syria, Morocco, Algeria, etc. in the north. And in the southern Africa, we have maize and wheat from Kenya down to South Africa. So we also are able to partition the fields into small, medium, and large fields. And this is done with an object-oriented program and a segmentation of fields that are 5 hectares or less, between 5 and 25 hectares, and 25 hectares and more. And we really find this is enormously useful for understanding who the commercial agriculture farmers are. And so we can see here that zoom in on the northern Africa, and then you can go to the next slide. So one of the big objectives here is to provide the statistically representative information. And so what our users do is they can select particular regions and then report out the total number of hectares that are in a particular agriculture hectares in an area, and then we have segmented further between small, medium, large, and then above 900, between 900 and 2,000 meters, and above 2,000 meters. And this is because many of these companies sell seeds which are tuned or focused on high altitude regions or low altitude region seed types. So for example, in Kenya, there's very specific seed varieties which are relevant for high altitude. And so they really want to know how many hectares are being cultivated in those regions. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. We can also we have a whole statistical query. If you would like more information, you can email me. My email is at the bottom left there, or you can email me at the University of Maryland. Thank you. So sorry about the announcements.
No, great. Thank you
It's
very
just the
much.
way it is. Exactly. Coming home from Ethiopia just now, actually. Crazy.
All right. I appreciate you making as much time as you could, and know we've kind of put you in a tough spot there.
Yeah.
So.
But the difference between our system and others is that ours is operational. We go about 6 weeks from the beginning to the end of. Yeah. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.
All right. Safe travels. All right. And now we'll move to our final presenter, Gary Eilerts. He's currently a contractor working with the Famine Early Warning Systems Network to build its data warehouse. And he's an early warning consultant for the University of Maryland Harvest activity. He was one of Fuse Activity's first Washington-based country analysts in 1985 and worked as a FuseNet project and regional manager for USAID until 2016. And he's also a senior food security expert for the WFP VAM program and FAO. And I think his concluding remarks should put a nice bow on this sort of variety of presentations we've seen. So with that, Gary, please take it away.
Sure. Thank you very much, Greg and Alyssa. I think it is very interesting how the progression of presentations has come. I'm going to be talking from the perspective of early warning, how we use a lot of the information that the presenters previous have been showing. From a perspective of time for early warning, there has been a large change since the days of the 1970s when we were looking at food balance sheets, which were, very useful at that point and are still used for some particular reasons. But as we discovered in the 80s, particularly around the time of the Ethiopian and the Sudan famine, they didn't give us the information that we needed for a focus on household food security, which we then started implementing in different ways. And I was actually a part of FUSE at that point, and we got faxed nutrition and rainfall data from Mauritania. And that was interesting, but it was quite difficult to put into a perspective, just as much as the food balance sheets were for the same purposes. And then in the middle of the 80s, we started using satellite imagery, which gave us really a new perspective about food insecurity at the household level by allowing us to see around the household and at the national level and even at the regional and global level. And then I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see that we've kind of moved back and forth from a very local perspective to sometimes a national and regional focus. And then more recently, we've been seeing some global tools that help us put a context around the local and have been very important in moving us towards what I'm talking about here as kind of an integrated systemic view of early warning. And by systemic view of early warning, I'm saying that, I think the state of the art right now is that we believe we need a focus on the populations exactly where they're found, the ones that are most of interest, the food insecure people in many parts of the world. And we put a high premium on getting information from those places very quickly. And this has been a great, we've seen a lot of progress over the years in being able to squeeze this data out of very, very local, very remote areas. So we know the quality of the local rainy season. We know food availability in the marketplace. We know market behavior in those places. We can see the impacts of conflict. But we also understand now and are prioritizing putting that data into a broader context that is sometimes sub-regional within the same country. It's national, it's at the regional level, or it's at the global level. And the quality of the local rainy season, we do want to know how it is conditioned by climate modes and trends at the global level. Similarly, the seasonal harvest, we do want to know at the local level how that looks in terms of global trends in food production and the availability of food from trade. So the way we see food security now is that we need all of these. And the question is, do we have all of them? But first I wanted to say that one of the first examples we had, and kind of pertinent to what we're talking about here today, is back in the mid-80s, we had local information like I was discussing in Mauritania, which we couldn't really put into a broader perspective, but satellite imagery was one of the first tools with which we could then put that into a broader perspective and say, well, is this shared regionally? Is there a better crop season in the east than the west? And it was a very important kind of paradigm shift for early warning. Currently, I think the state of the art of early warning, and most of these things that I've put up here, these are tools that are available to us, although they're not all perfect. They're not all available from a local to a global scale. But I think our paradigm now says that it is important in early warning terms to be able to look at things like soil moisture prior to the season, because that's an important impact on planting prospects and the next harvest. We of course want to know what weather is going to occur and how and the climate patterns that the areas are subject to. We of course now have a focus on livelihoods and household income and asset measures, and we have living standards, measurements, surveys, and other sources of information that help us get there. It's still kind of patchy, but we're using that a lot. Agricultural production, I put a little red marker right next to it because we don't have much. We have, for the countries that we've been interested in, we have some agricultural production, but it's really been a very patchy collection so far. Food prices, in about 2008, we woke up to the global food price crisis, and we did a crash course in trying to gather, use, and understand food prices, to understand what the issues were at almost any place in the globe, particularly the areas that are food insecure, understand if they were being affected by global problems or by local problems, and they continue to be a very important part of the process, one for which we have a good amount of data, but we could still do better. One of the big deficits in our databases is food trade measures. A large percentage, probably over 50% of almost everybody's food supply is supplied by trade. You buy it in the market, and that may be a local trade, it may be a global trade, but as of yet, our community has very limited access to trade in terms that help us condition our expectations about food insecurity at the local, global, national, regional levels. FuseNet has been working with other parties in Southern and Eastern Africa to gather informal trade data on maize in those areas, and that gives us a perspective that is always useful, but it's a very limited focus. So we need a lot more information about food trade to put into our calculations. Gridded population estimates, we always need to know how many people are affected in terms of the responses that we would project to set up in response to problems. Gridded population estimates have been a big boon to the ability to put these problems into some perspective that is meaningful for a decision maker. Human impact outcome measures, we still have very limited amounts of this. We get very late nutritional survey data. We get a few other things that are really not major inputs, but we really need more information about how the conditions of food availability, access, stability are affecting the populations in each of those areas that we're looking at, and we're still quite short in that respect. I'm going to switch now to talk about one of these issues, the ag production question. We started out recently and a couple of years ago and said, well, it's about time to try to get some subnational ag statistics together and see what kind of a historical perspective that gives us, and to see whether it helps us to make forecasts in the future. So we started with a small target of about 25 countries that FuseNet monitors and evaluates on a regular basis. And we got through those, and those are definitely some of the worst in terms of their historical archive of subnational agricultural statistics. But given the success that we had with that, and with the support of the NASA Harvest activity, we were able to put some more resources into exploring what is available easily and concisely from international sources. And so over the last couple of years, we've been gathering global subnational agricultural statistics and trying to put them into a database with which we can compare satellite estimates of yield, which yield is very important for us, but it doesn't get down to the bottom line that most decision makers need, which is what's the shortfall? What amount of data needs to be supplied in terms of food assistance? Are people able to cope with the amount that isn't there? One of the big issues of the data that we have had up until now is that we feel like we have good yield data, but like Molly was just explaining, area planted is still the missing variable for us to be able to fully exploit the better yield estimates that several of the presenters before me have been talking about. We still need to go the extra mile to get quantities, because those are what drive decisions, and we've been making a lot of assumptions without data so far. So thanks to the Harvest contribution and to the efforts of a lot of people in the field, and without having to go out to 100 or 180, 200 countries, finding most of what we found on the web, what we have right now is a collection that looks just about like this. It looks like we're going to have significant agricultural statistics for about 165 countries. And by significant, I mean we're going to have national for some very small countries like Belize, but we'll have some number of years that would give us a perspective beyond the high point and the low point in the last 10 years. We'd have some vision of how much food is being produced at those countries. And for most of them, most of the 165, we're going to have subnational data for in the region of at least an average of 10 years. And that includes some that go only down to the first administrative unit subdivisions. It includes others that go down to the fourth one. There's quite a mix. There's some countries that we have stats for from 1960 going up to the present. There are others that where we have the last 5 years. Places like Cambodia, you understand why that happened. There are a lot of different circumstances, but if we add up what we have, the total number of years of data that we have is about 3,300 something, and it might grow a little bit. We're still working on this. The number of subnational ag stat reporting units, we have about 15,000 of them actually in the current set. In those, there are about 5,000 crops that have been reported by these 165 countries. And of that, there's just a couple of hundred of unique crops. But we have one note I should make is that we have, where we have extracted the official statistics, we have taken every statistic for every food crop, except in many cases, the fruit crops, the perennial tree crops. But we take, you know, all of the asparagus and the beetroot and everything else, because we're not quite sure that there might be a use for it down the road, but we do want to have some fairly comprehensive view of what area is being used for agricultural production, and that means we've got to get almost all of those crops. And as you see here, the final data points that we have, it looks like it's going to be over 3 million. And by data point, I mean not just a variable, but I mean a place, a season, a crop, an area, and a yield and production figure. And we do keep all of the seasonal information that is given. In many cases, it's quite comprehensive. In other places, it's not, and that could be an issue because seasonal production is very important in some countries which don't provide a breakout of their production by seasons. And then we also try to keep track and collect the information they give us on production systems. Of course, you'd like to know if a crop is irrigated or not. And then there are commercial crops, there are small farmer crops, there are kitchen gardens. There's a whole range of different terms that are used for the production systems. But all in all, we think that we have a pretty comprehensive view without having had to go to each one of these countries of the quantity of food that has been produced in the world over the last probably 20 years. The heart of the database resides from about 2000 to 2018. We can go before that, but then the numbers of countries start dropping out pretty quickly. But I think for those of you that are looking for and could use numbers, statistics, we've got quite a lot of it. Another problem though, and this gets to what a lot of you guys are dealing with right now, is that to use these stats, and given the way that reporting units change over time, you're going to need not only the statistics to affiliate them with a place on the ground, but you're going to need shapefiles. And so we kind of realized that early, and we started putting an awful lot of effort into providing a genealogical record of changes at the first and second and sometimes at the third level of administrative units. And we've done that now for about 109 countries. And the findings that we found have allowed us to project that we're going to do something we never would have thought we could do, but we think we're going to be able to regenerate most of the historic shape files, like it says here, for about 96% of them. We're going to be able to generate shape files that relate to the shapes at the time of the statistics, that the statistics were gathered. based on the genealogy and the most current shapefile that is available. Given here is kind of a graphic representation of what those genealogies look like. And you'll see that for Kazakhstan, which I chose because it's actually one of the most complex and difficult to work with because of its history of changes over time, you'll see that in the upper right, West Kazakhstan, if we wanted to find its boundaries for 1974, it's pretty much a straight shot backward. There's no change in the shape, except some changes in names. So if you find a statistic in 1989 for Uralsk, we can tell you that it's actually today West Kazakhstan, and you can compare those statistics over that period. Similarly, if you go down to the next one, Shymkent City in South Kazakhstan, they split in 2018. And so you need to know that they split, but if you want to find out, you want to compare their production, you can move backwards to the left by recognizing that they came from South Kazakhstan and that in 1974, they actually came from Shymkent. So, and we can take the current shapes of Shymkent City in South Kazakhstan and recreate the shape of South Kazakhstan and then go backwards. And then if you look down a little bit further to North Kazakhstan on the right, and you go back 1-2 steps, you'll see that Kokshetau and North Kazakhstan merged into North Kazakhstan. And at that point, we're unable to take the current North Kazakhstan boundary and run it back to what it looked like in 1974, unless we can find some shapefiles for 1989 or 1974 that we could then run forward. But basically, we think that we're going to be able to generate on the fly the historical shapefiles that you'll need to associate the statistics with their place on the ground in the satellite imagery. What do we want to do with all of this, and what do we hope that some of you might be interested in doing with it? Well, we think that it'll help us make better ag production estimates by having some basis for understanding what the production was, what the area planted was, how much it varied, how it responded to different climate modes. So that's one thing that's very important to us. But we're also going to be looking at some things that we've never been able to do before. And there have been some recent work on synchronous crop failures. Well, we've got a really good basis to go back quite far in almost all of the countries that produce agriculture to see whether the crop failures, how broadly they're shared in time and space, and how they're related to the climate modes of the time. We're also going to be able to understand better how food prices and production patterns co-vary. Do you want a global yield gap map according to the surveys that have been carried out on the ground? Well, here's a way that you can get it. Along the way, because quality of information is always an issue, we've made a special point of trying to gather the national explanations of their crop estimation procedures so that you can judge yourself the amount of trust you ought to put in these numbers. And then I think the next thing that we're trying to think about is how do we address the food trade database that we need in order to understand of the crop that is produced in any one place, where does it go? Who benefits from the sale, who benefits from the purchase, and what do those trade patterns look like over time? So status right now, this is almost my last slide. 125 countries are loaded, the remaining ones are being cleaned. It's a huge job. It far exceeded our expectations, so we're going to have to actually change some of the programming that we put into the database to hold this stuff. And for access right now, the best place, the best contacts for access to it, you should contact, I would imagine, either Alyssa or myself at FuseNet, and we can help you work out the details of how to get access to the data. So, Greg and Alyssa, that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, Gary. Thank you very much. Maybe we could run maybe 10 minutes over if there's interest and try and tackle a couple of these questions that have been sent in. Belen, there was a question early on that said, or I think it was related to your presentation, asking if national statistics are computed from subnational statistics, how come the error in the yield estimates at the national level is about half of the ones for yield estimates at the subnational level? I don't know if you're,
I'd say we've got a base of data that we can try to answer that question from. Let's look at it. I don't know what the answer would be.
Yeah. Belen, do you have any input?
Yeah, well, generally, since the model is calibrated at subnational level, when you aggregate it at national level, the error decreases. So the model is more sensitive to subnational level, like variabilities. So that's why the error at subnational level is more like it's higher, and when you aggregate everything at national, like those variabilities are reduced, and like all the errors are like kind of compensated. So that's why the error at national level is lower.
Mm-hmm. That's likely, and I'd say it would be interesting to see whether that's true in how many countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, generally it's reduced like half of it in almost every country I've run it on.
Mm-hmm.
Great. There was another one that was maybe a little easier to answer. I think it was for summer. Let's see, let me just try and find it here quickly. Yeah, I was asking about flying a drone in Ethiopia, and if you've investigated the political issues, I guess, and a potential ban about that, and maybe that's a question that can be more widely expressed. What are some of the limitations of using drones in the developing world, or actually anywhere in the world, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In Tanzania, they are quite open to using drones, and they've really accepted the use of drones. In Ethiopia, it's not the case. So we've been in conversations with ATA about the Agricultural Transformation Agency in Ethiopia to see how to do this. And James works very closely with them, so I'm going to actually pass the question to him.
Okay, thank you. No, it's surprising. I think there's a general feeling that drones are very restricted in Ethiopia for a lot of reasons. And actually, in some level, there is a fair amount of drone use being used for weddings, which is an interesting kind of a part of this. Anyway, drones are being used by the government agency, ATA, to check on wheat yields. In some parts of the country, they have a commercialization kind of strategy where they're trying to send the drones out early and then post what the prospective productivity is going to be from these areas, and they're trying to get traders to sort of be interested in bidding on contracts. It's kind of a sophisticated model to buy these wheat early based on these early drone use. So I'm excited to be working with Summer. She's bringing that expertise from Tanzania to sort of work with us here in Ethiopia, and we've had discussions with ATA, and they've gone very well. We will have access to using the drones in areas that we need to predict early crop season productivity for both our reasons and both the commercial reasons that ATA are. So it's sort of a joint effort that both groups are benefiting from. So I think that there has been some in the past problems with drone use, but it seems to me they're working out some policy guidelines on how they can be used. And moving forward, it seems that it's a new technology that can be used. Okay.
Great. Do any of the other panelists have any thoughts on or experience with the drones? Okay. Maybe then we'll move to another question from Francis Kamizi. I think this was for Jake, asking, would it be possible to share your data and the tool that you used? I think this is to set up your analysis and build your relationships.
So a lot of the description of these methods has been published in several papers between 2015 and now. a lot of all the satellite data that we use is freely available. And in terms of ground validation data, that's provided by our collaborators. In this case, CIMMIT has provided the crop cut data, so it's not, that would be up to them whether or not we could share it. But yeah, I'm happy to set up meetings with anyone interested in learning more about the specifics of the yield estimation model. And yeah.
Great, thanks. And there was one other question, I think this is maybe Belen again, maybe Jake, and it was asking, what are the challenges in dealing with multi-cropping? And I think that's maybe where you have multiple seasons, or maybe where you have crops that are interleaved, double cropping basically in the same plot. Do either of you have thoughts on that? I'm sure this would maybe present some challenges in terms of estimations of area and also yield when you have it doubled up like that.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue, especially in Africa, where, for instance, maize and cassava or maize and beans are commonly cropped in the same plots. So those plots can have a different spectral signature than a solely maize or a solely cassava, for example, plot, which can lead to biases in your yield assumptions if you're assuming the signal is purely from maize. And that really comes down to, can we get good data to distinguish those intercropped fields from individually cropped fields. So in my presentation, I showed an example distinguishing wheat from other crops, but with the right data, and we could potentially use similar methods to distinguish intercropped fields from individually cropped fields and treat those separately and use different models to predict yields for those separately.
Great. Thank you. There were two questions here at the end related to Gary's talk. First, Gary, there was a request for the contact for who should be contacted for the subnational statistics in the data warehouse. So do you have an email address or a reference point for people who are interested in accessing that database?
Yeah, I don't know. Alyssa might want to chime in with somebody there that she would prefer be the contact. Mine is just my first initial last name at usaid.gov. GI alerts at usaid.gov.
Yeah, careful, your inbox might get full really quick.
Yeah, well, that's the danger, but
Yeah.
that's also an opportunity, I think.
That's true.
And the same for me. I don't know if my email is on a flyer or where, but it's you're welcome to contact me, or if you go to the Harvest website and contact info@NASA Harvest, it'll find its way to me, and with your request, I can forward it on to the right person in the program.
There was one other question, Gary, from, I think we lost the cover slide there. Gary, was related to the, if you've thought of somehow making these data, rather than related to shape files, incorporating them in some kind of gridded format so that information could be maybe more easily accessed. And this question pointed out that Naven Ramankudi his data set has had widespread uptake because he's shared it as a netcdf file and basically changed those or converted those shapes to a gridded format where I think the data was more accessible. Do you have any plans to do anything like that, or is that maybe a little beyond the scope and there are enough challenges with the current setup?
Well, we have plenty of challenges and we don't have enough level of effort, but yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the best uses of somebody's time, I don't know whose, is to essentially do what you've done with the chirps and you know what we've got with the land scan, put it all in a gridded format and let's use them together. And you know, I think the same thing you could do with crop calendars too. Let's have a spatial and temporally integrated crop calendar on the top of this so that you can ask really interesting questions. So we don't have the level of effort to do that, but that's kind of what the idea of putting it out there is that maybe others can help, or maybe others would you know, form some consortium to try to do this.
That's great. So I think we're about 10 minutes over. I would like to maybe take this time to wrap up, to thank all the presenters for their effort in making this, I think, a really well-rounded and insightful and interesting panel. I would like to thank all the attendees for their attention, and hopefully they found it useful in getting a perspective. You know, I think we got to see a number of presentations that involved, you know, freely available data as well as privately collected data, you know, coarse scale and fine scale, multinational to subnational, and a variety of techniques. I think it was a really useful and insightful webinar. So I would like to thank everyone, and with that, we'll wrap it up. Just a reminder that the video will be available from the IFPRI site, and we will, I think, let you know maybe through the webinar tools, a follow-up email with the location of that. So if there's anyone else on the panel who has any concluding thoughts, if not, then we'll wrap it up, and thanks again.
I just want to say, Greg, thanks for moderating the discussion. If you want to send a question to any of the speakers in particular, everyone is on the IFPRI website. They have the link on how to contact them, so hopefully that will be helpful.
Just like to say thank you to Summer and IFPRI for doing this as well. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll get something like this together again soon. Bye now.